Hello, and welcome to a short presentation from Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer on the cost of remediating Canada's contaminated sites. Section 79.3D of the Parliament of Canada Act provides that it's the mandate of the PBO to estimate the financial cost of any proposal that relates to a matter over which Parliament has jurisdiction, when requested to do so by a parliamentarian. The PBO was asked under this limb of his mandate to estimate the cost to remediate contaminated sites over which the federal government has responsibility and compare this cost to figures reported in the Public Accounts of Canada. It should be emphasized that these results are an estimate. The actual cost of remediating the sites in the inventory will depend on the degree to which past and present site assessment and remediation cost characteristics hold true going forward. After careful analysis, we estimated that the total cost of remediating the contaminated sites will be approximately $3.9 billion, which is $2.1 billion more than the liability reported in the public accounts. We'll talk about the details in a moment, but this estimate of $3.9 billion doesn't include the $3.1 billion in liabilities that are associated with the 6 largest sites, as well as $200 million that are under the control of consolidated crown corporations and other entities. But let's first talk about what a contaminated site is. At its most simple, contaminated sites are areas of land or water affected by hazardous waste or pollution. Contamination can arise from a number of sources. It has arisen from past mining practices, as is the case with Giant Mine, where arsenic was stored underground without proper mechanisms to ensure its containment. It's also arisen from the dumping of oil or fuel waste, and it's also occurred as a result of activities that produce radioactive waste, such as in Port Hope, Ontario. Thus, the contaminant itself might be anything from hydrocarbons that have leaked into the ground from a faulty generator to heavy metals found in an unexploded munitions dump. The technical definition of a contaminated site is an area in which substances occur at concentrations, 1, above background levels, and pose or are likely to pose an immediate or long-term hazard to human health or the environment, or 2, exceeding levels specified in policies and regulations. Normally, over time, contaminated sites are remediated. This basically means reversing or stopping the damage to human health and the environment caused by the hazardous waste or pollution. This may involve completely removing the pollutant, which is colloquially known as dig and dump, injecting substances that neutralize the contaminants, installing impermeable barriers that contain the contaminants, or simply risk managing the site, which can be as simple as putting a fence around it so people can't come into contact with the contaminant. The federal government reports the liability for remediating Canada's contaminated sites annually in the public accounts. The government recognizes this liability pursuant to the public sector accounting standards. Those standards set out when liabilities for contaminated sites should be recognized. Under the Public Sector Accounting Standard 3260, the federal government should recognize a liability for a contaminated site when 1. An environmental standard exists, 2. Contamination exceeds the environmental standard, 3. The government is directly responsible or accepts responsibility, 4. It is expected that future economic benefits will be given up. In most cases, this means that the government will have to pay. And 5. A reasonable estimate of the amount can be made. For the government to recognize a liability, all of these requirements must be satisfied. As has already been shown, the liabilities that are reported to Parliament in the public accounts are lower than the PBO's cost estimate. This is so for 3 reasons. First, the PBO's estimate includes costs for sites that have not been assessed and those that are not fully assessed. As discussed earlier, the public sector accounting standards only require recognition of a liability where a reasonable estimate of the amount can be made. If the government hasn't assessed a site, by definition, a reasonable estimate of the amount can't be made, and therefore no liability need be booked. Second, the PBO's estimate includes costs for sites yet to be identified. The PBO projected the number of new sites likely to be added in the future to the federal government's inventory. The public sector accounting standards don't require the government to book liabilities for sites they are not sure yet exist. Third, The PBO's estimate increases the costs of some sites that are currently in active remediation. This is because the PBO's analysis indicated that the liabilities reported in the public accounts for many contaminated sites increased during the remediation process. Because of this, their liabilities had to be increased using statistical methods. But we get ahead of ourselves. Let's have a quick look at, broadly speaking, the environmental liabilities of the federal government. The $10.6 billion the federal government has booked to satisfy its environmental liabilities can be broken down into two groups. $5.7 billion is booked for future asset restoration, and $4.9 billion is booked for contaminated sites. Future asset restoration is a liability recognized for the decommissioning of Canada's nuclear facilities. These liabilities were not included in the PBO cost estimate. Contaminated sites can be broken down into a few different groups. The first group are what might be called the Big Five sites. They include Faro Mine, Colmac Mine, Giant Mine, Cape Dyer, which is part of the Dew Line, and Goose Bay Air Base. The second group that might be identified are the sites at Port Hope, Ontario, which contain low levels of radiation. And finally, the inventory contains 10,845 open sites located all over the country. These open sites are either in remediation or waiting to be assessed. We call these general inventory sites. The liability reported in the public accounts for remediating all contaminated sites currently sits at $4.9 billion. If we break down these figures into the groups just mentioned, $1.8 billion is earmarked for the Big Five sites, $1 billion is earmarked for the low-level radiation sites around Port Hope, and $1.8 billion for general inventory sites. $200 million is also included in the $4.9 billion figure for sites not included in the inventory. For those of you quick with numbers, I should point out that the figures don't always add up correctly due to rounding. We decided that we'd estimate the total cost associated with the general inventory sites. We decided not to estimate the cost of the Big Five or Port Hope sites because of the small sample size. It's hard to estimate the cost of remediating these sites because of their unique nature and that there are so few of them, which makes using statistical tools difficult, if not impossible. The information contained in the inventory for these sites was helpful in estimating cost. It included details on such things as how much has been spent on a site, what is still expected to be spent on a site, which is known as a site's liability, the site's class, and the step the site is currently at in remediation. We'll talk further about how sites are classified later. It's worthwhile noting that the PBO is not the first to engage in this sort of cost estimation. The U.S. Superfund program, which includes some of the worst contaminated sites for which the U.S. government is responsible, was costed by the U.S. Congressional Budget Office, otherwise known as the CBO, in 1994, and by Resources for the Future, a U.S. think tank contracted by the U.S. Congress in 2001. For those of you who might be interested, the CBO report can be obtained from their website, and the analysis conducted by Resources for the Future was published in a book. The Resources for the Future book provides in-depth information on both the Superfund program in general and the methodology that they used to cost the sites. I highly recommend it for anyone that needs to perform a statistical costing estimate of contaminated sites. In order to carry out our analysis, we obtained a copy of the Treasury Board Secretariat Federal Contaminated Site Inventory. The inventory is a database that contains all the information about each contaminated site. It includes yearly records for each site stating, among other things, which remediation step the site is at, the site's current outstanding liability, and the amount spent on the site for remediation and assessment in the year. Contaminated sites in the inventory transition from step 1 through 10, with 1 representing when a site first enters the system, and step 10 representing when the site is in long-term monitoring. Sites are also classified as 1, 2, or 3, or N. Class 1 sites are considered the worst sites, and Class N sites don't require remediation. Needless to say, Class 1 sites cost considerably more to remediate than Class 3 sites. In its original form, the inventory had yearly information, but not running totals that spanned multiple years. In order to track total costs over time, we added additional fields to the database for each site, keeping running totals of how much had been spent on both remediation and assessment. By summing the total spent to date on a site and its current outstanding liability, we were able to determine the total estimated cost for remediating a currently open site. Using these running totals, we divided sites into groups based on their class, that is 1, 2, or 3, and the year they started remediation. We called each of these groups cohorts. We used the weighted average of each of these cohorts to determine the average remediation cost for a class of site. We did this by using a statistical technique called ordered logistic regression to assign classes to the 5,547 sites that hadn't yet been assigned a class. We used a statistical technique called ordered logistic regression to assign classes to the 5,547 sites that hadn't yet been assigned a class. Also, we estimated that an additional 229 sites would be added to the database in the future. This is all described in detail in the report. We then calculated the total cost of remediating all the sites in the general inventory using the average estimated cost for each class of site. The orange dots you see on the chart are the average costs for each class. The average estimated remediation cost for a Class 1 site is $2 million. Class 2 sites cost on average $280,000, and Class 3 sites cost $64,000. Because of their relatively large average costs, Class 1 sites are the primary driver of this estimate. An important note about these average costs is that they include those Class 1, 2, and 3 sites that close without ever incurring remediation costs. If these sites were excluded, the average would necessarily be higher. In order to perform the estimate, we had to classify a number of unclassified sites, both those currently in the inventory and a small number of sites expected to enter the inventory in the future. We did this by using ordered logistic regression, as mentioned earlier. We estimated the remaining cost of remediating all the sites in each class by some simple arithmetic. We multiplied the estimated number of sites in each class by the estimated average cost for each class. This results in a total estimated remaining cost of $2.9 billion for Class 1 sites, $870 million for Class 2 sites, and $150 million for Class 3 sites. We could figure out how much above and beyond the liabilities reported in the public accounts these figures are by subtracting the existing liabilities for each class from them. The result is an additional cost of $1.5 billion, $532 million, and $111 million for Class 1, 2, and 3 sites respectively. Simply summing these three values and subtracting $62 million for the existing liabilities that are recorded against the unclassified sites results in the PBO estimated additional increase of $2.1 billion to the existing $1.8 billion reported in the public accounts. Even though we didn't estimate the cost of the Big 5 and Port Hope sites, we did perform a historical analysis of these sites to see if there were any interesting trends. We'll start with the Big 5 sites, which are Faro Mine, Colmac Mine, Giant Mine, Cape Dewar and the Dew Line, and Goose Bay Air Base. From 2006 through 2013, we see that the liabilities for these 5 sites have increased from $700 million to $1.8 billion, which works out to an 11.4% compounded yearly increase. This increase in liability has occurred even though $500 million has been spent remediating these sites over the same period. So we see that the total estimated cost over 8 years has increased from $700 million to $2.3 billion. Given this historical trend, it's likely that these sites will see further increases over the next several years. The historical trend for the Port Hope sites paints a more encouraging picture. Here we see the reported liabilities reach their maximum in 2011 of $1.1 billion, and since that time have decreased by the same amount that has been spent on remediation. This is what we would expect to happen when everything is working according to plan. It goes without saying that this is in contrast to the Big 5 sites, where liabilities are still increasing even though remediation expenditures are being made every year. It goes without saying that this is in contrast to the Big Five sites, where liabilities are increasing even though remediation expenditures are being made every year. So, that brings us to the end of our presentation. Before leaving, it's worth noting that the cost estimate presented here only includes remediation of previously identified contaminants that the government has had experience with. The estimate doesn't include the potential of new contaminants, which would increase any estimate that might be generated. One such contaminant is PFOS. This is a chemical that was used prior to 2002 in firefighting foams used at airports, specifically for jet fuel fires. As it turns out, this chemical has been found in groundwater at some airports across the country. Remediation plans for PFOS are still being developed, and as such, liabilities haven't yet been assigned. Therefore, as liabilities for remediating PFOS-contaminated sites are recognized, the estimated remediation costs reported here will increase.